Making sure my Restream.io setup's working. Let me make sure that's working. Okay, it's working. Okay. Just a moment here. Alright. Looks like everything's working. Very good. So let us begin with Chapter 3 of Hitler's Revolution by Tador. Let me just make sure that this is working. Okay. Okay. Chapter 3. European Diplomacy. Africa. Throughout his tenure in office, Hitler was active in foreign affairs. A major goal, abolishing the restrictions imposed on Germany by the Versailles Treaty, required him to negotiate with the signatory powers that had ratified it. This was an uphill battle, since these nations benefited from the compact. The Führer strove to realize his goals through non-belligerent means. The last war had provoked a communist revolution in Russia. His own country had nearly suffered a similar fate in 1918. Hitler believed that another European conflict would be exploited by the Soviets to overthrow existing governments and, quote, lead to the collapse of present-day social and state order. The Reichskanzler weighed foreign policy decisions according to their advantages for Germany. Contrary to the cosmopolitan attitude of today's democratic leaders, he allowed no particular obligations to the collective interests of an abstract, quote, global community to influence his actions. In his own words, I cannot feel responsible for the fate of a world which showed no sympathy for the miserable plight of my own people. I regard myself as being called upon by Providence to serve only my own nation. Great Britain and France were among the primary advocates of the Versailles system. Though aware of the treaty's injustices, neither of their governments initiated a single voluntary concession to Germany from 1920 to 1939. The objective of National Socialist foreign affairs was securing Lebensraum, sufficient living space to produce nourishment for Germany's increasing population, and natural resources for industry. A serious hindrance to economic well-being was her lack of overseas colonies. Prior to World War I, the control of expansive territories in Africa had provided the Imperial Reich with raw materials. Nearly 12 million native inhabitants had offered a market for German-manufactured goods, and the flourishing trade had made a substantial contribution to industrial growth and prosperity. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which lulled the Reich's government into accepting an armistice in 1918, promised a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. This proved to be an illusion. In Africa, France gained the former German colony of Cameroon, totaling nearly 50,000 square miles. The Versailles Settlement awarded Russia and Rwanda and Burundi to Belgium. England took the lion's share, incorporating German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, and Togo, augmenting the British Empire by over 630,000 square miles. Italy received about 50,000 square miles. Britain and Japan divided Germany's Pacific colonies. The Allies classified the seized colonies as mandate states that England and France administered as trustees. This avoided the appearance of outright annexation, which would have raised the inconvenient argument that so much valuable territory appropriated from Germany should be credited to the reparations account. The League of Nations Charter stated that administering colonies, quote, inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, end quote, was a, quote, sacred trust of civilization. It sanctioned Anglo-French colonial administration as a blessing for underdeveloped nations, overlooking the fact that Syria, India, Egypt, and several other countries under British and European subjugation had requested independence after World War I. The peace treaty created other obstacles for German commerce. Beginning in 1922, the Allies imposed a 26% duty on all German export wares. Despite this disadvantage, Germany continued to conduct overseas trade in order to meet reparations payments and import necessities previously available from Africa. The Germans' profit margin was too small to alleviate the economic distress to industry. A German delegate of Versailles, Otto Landsberg, stated, "This peace is a slow murder of the German people." The worldwide financial crisis caused German exports to sink by 2/3 between 1930 and 1933. Hitler publicly reopened the colonial issue in September 1935. Speaking in Nuremberg, he announced that Germany would not relinquish her claims in Africa. Days later, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, addressed the topic before the League of Nations in Geneva. Dismissing the notion that the ex-German colonies should be returned, Hoare argued that it was necessary only to guarantee that colonies without possessions on the Dark Continent Hoare argued that it was necessary only to guarantee that countries without possessions on the Dark Continent should have fair access to their natural resources through an open-door policy. Berlin pointed out that the mother countries, England, France, and Belgium, would unavoidably enjoy preference in trade. The option to buy raw materials from Mandate states was of little use to Germany anyway. She lacked the purchasing power to do so, thanks to the loss of her colonies. Nearly a year and a half passed before the League of Nations appointed a committee to investigate. Its findings endorsed Hoare's position. In 1936, Hitler authorized Schacht to negotiate settlements with France and England regarding some of their major differences with Germany. Schacht introduced a proposal to change the status of French-controlled Cameroon and Togo, Britain's smaller African acquisition. Under the plan, the Germans would assume economic management of, but not sovereignty over, the two Mandate states. Both would maintain an open-door trade policy with other countries, as Hoare had suggested, while the Reich would enjoy commercial advantages to compensate for the previous forfeiture of its African territories. The compromise avoided the impression that the Allies were returning the German colonies, which would have represented a tacit admission that their seizure was unjust. Considering Germany's poverty of natural resources and the pride of its population, Schacht's proposal was moderate. London and Paris categorically rejected it the following winter. Subsequent personal dialogues between Hitler and British statesmen proved equally fruitless. In November 1937, the Führer hosted the English emissary Lord Halifax at Berchtesgaden. He asked his guest what London proposed regarding Africa. Halifax admitted that the mandate of the Versailles Treaty must be set right. He stipulated that England could not negotiate this without the other continental powers, and that the redistribution of the colonies could only take place within the framework of an overall European settlement. Halifax offered no proposals. The following March, Neville Henderson, the British ambassador in Berlin, warned Hitler that English public opinion was especially sensitive about the African issue. He vaguely suggested that Germany could perhaps receive administration of the Congo. This was not even a British dominion. Hitler questioned the purpose of such an arrangement instead of solving the colonial problem, quote, in the simplest and most natural way, namely by giving back German colonies. He again pledged not to force the issue, expressing willingness to patiently wait 4, 6, or 10 years for a favorable solution. As for the genuine attitude of the British government, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain confided to his cabinet a year later that discussing with Germany the return of her colonies was, quote, completely out of the question. In March 1939, British Secretary of Trade Robert Hudson told the German economist Helmut Wohltath that the English people would never accept the transfer. For his part, Hitler kept the promise once made to Chamberlain that he would not present Germany's appeal as a belligerent demand. Geneva. With Germany lacking colonies, Hitler consolidated the Reich's commercial position on the continent, focusing on the southeastern European market. This coincided with his intention to regain frontier provinces of Germany proper, some with valuable industry, which the Versailles construction took from the Reich and awarded to neighboring states. Italy, France, Belgium, Denmark, Lithuania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia now controlled territories populated by ethnic Germans, whose loss weakened Germany. The diplomatic question that received Hitler's initial priority was national security. Article 160 of the treaty stated that the armed forces, the Reichswehr, may be deployed, quote, exclusively for maintaining order within German territory and as a border police, end quote. The Allies, therefore, denied Germany the right to protect her frontiers from foreign aggression. The lack of adequate defense forces had already caused negative consequences for the Reich. When the Germans fell 1.6 behind on the crippling reparations payments to France, the French and Belgian armies militarily occupied the Ruhr industrial region in January 1923. In Essen, French troops shot 14 German miners resisting the invaders' attempt to confiscate coal. Others, the French arrested and deported to France's colonies. They forced 80,000 Germans to leave their homes in the Ruhr and relocate further into Germany. Clemenceau told his secretary, quote, "We'll stay longer than 15 years. We'll stay 100 years if we must, until they pay us what they owe us. And after we've withdrawn, if these swine violate their obligation, then fine, we'll occupy again." French and Belgian troops remained until the summer of 1925. The governments of Germany and Austria arranged to form a customs union in 1931. The elimination of tariffs would boost commerce between the two countries and lessen the economic distress, particularly in Austria. France interpreted this fearsome bloc of her former antagonists as a violation of the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which forbade Austria to become part of the Reich. Paris threatened to boycott German wares and initiate price wars to disrupt continental trade. Possessing the largest army in Europe, France was in a position to dictate terms without arbitration. That September, Austrian Chancellor Johannes Schober announced that his government would abandon plans for a trade agreement with Germany. U.S. President Hoover remarked, quote, "A customs union with a customs union with a little country of 6 million can scarcely be conceived as a serious threat. This is nothing more than a new, crass example of European power politics." The incident demonstrated that without the armed forces, Germany and Austria would remain unable to conduct an independent foreign policy. The League of Nations had been holding preliminary talks for several years in preparation for a universal disarmament conference scheduled for 1932. In February 1927, Belgian Foreign Minister Amelia van der Velde predicted, quote, "Either the other powers must reduce their armies in proportion to the German Reichswehr, or the peace treaty becomes invalid and Germany claims the right to possess fighting forces capable of defending her territory." The disarmament conference opened in Geneva in February 1932. Germany, a member of the League since 1927, demanded military parity with the other European powers. Delegates debated the issue for over 4 months without progress. In June, President Hoover proposed the reduction by 2/3 of all ground and naval forces. He recommended sending bombers to the scrapyard and banning strategic aerial bombardment. Oh god, just a side comment here. How strategic aerial bombardment was definitely not abandoned, and they took out almost every single square mile of German city during the Second World War. Moving on. The plan found favor with Italy and the USSR, but France rejected it. Berlin saw in Franco-German dissonance a primary hindrance to the conference. On August 23, 1932, the Reichswehr and the Reichsforeign Office therefore asked France's ambassador, André François Poncet, for a private audience. At the meeting, General Kurt von Schleicher presented moderate suggestions to François Poncet. Germany wished to develop prototypes of combat aircraft, armored vehicles, and heavy artillery, but pledged not to put them into mass production. Schleicher's plan called for an increase in military personnel by 30,000 soldiers per year. Considering that the French army numbered 655,000 men, it would take the Reich over 18 years to achieve parity. Furthermore, the 30,000 annual recruits would serve an enlistment of just 3 months. Paris rejected Berlin's modest proposals in a note on September 11, 1932. The French bluntly reminded the Germans of their obligation to observe the arms limitations imposed by the Versailles Treaty. Within 2 days, the Germans notified the president of the Geneva Conference that Germany was withdrawing from the talks. 3 months later, England, France, and Italy conceded that Germany must receive the same rights in a security system valid for all nations, and that this would be on the agenda. The German delegation thereupon returned to Geneva. This was the state of Europe's arms race when Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. So in other words, Germany was being wronged long before Hitler came to power. Anyhow, he inherited a military establishment whose ordnance department had recently estimated that there was only enough ammunition stockpiled for 1 hour of combat. So obviously, Germany had not been preparing for war prior to Hitler, and when he arrived in power, it was not anywhere near ready for any type of war, nor was it planning on conducting a war. So, British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald introduced a comprehensive armaments plan on March 16th. It permitted Germany to double the size of the Reichswehr to 200,000 men. It called for France to reduce her continental army to the same number, but granted her an additional 200,000 to police colonists. MacDonald proposed a 200,000-man fighting force for Italy as well, plus 50,000 for her overseas possessions. The USSR would maintain 500,000 men under arms, Poland 200,000, Czechoslovakia 100,000. All countries except Germany would have an air force. Almost every nation affected responded favorably. France, however, categorically rejected the plan. So basically, France rejected the plan of Germany having 1/10 of its neighbors' armies. Not even that. And no air force, and everyone else getting an air force. So, yeah. We'll see later in the diplomatic correspondences why Germany's neighbors were being so unfair to Germany. The Jew central bankers, once Germany decided to remove the Jew central bankers from power, demanded a war to stop Germany from having financial independence and sovereignty over its people. This comes later in the book. This is my 4th time reading it, I think. But moving on, the German diplomat Freiherr von Freytag-Leuenhofen summarized the implications confronting Hitler and in his deliberations. Quote, the forces it allowed Germany in no way guaranteed her parity with the other great powers, nor corresponded to the size of her population and natural resources. Germany would be permitted to maintain a field army of 200,000 men. France, on the other hand, was promised 200,000 men for the mother country and just as many for the colonies. In case of war, these colonial troops would be immediately transported to Europe, so France would have twice as strong a standing army right from the start, not even including reservists. For Poland, too, whose population is just half of Germany's, the plan also envisioned 200,000 men. So basically, Poland was less than half of Germany's population, and Germany was arguing that they'd be allowed to have half as many soldiers as a country that was less than half as big as them. And this was just one of its many neighbors, Poland, that it wouldn't even have parity with per capita. Moving on. Considering the entire French alliance system, there would be a fighting force on the French side of 1,025,000 men, whereas Germany could only parry with an army of 1/5 its strength. In the Reichstag on May 17, 1933, Hitler publicly responded, Germany would be ready without delay to disband her entire military establishment and destroy what little remains of her arsenal if the other nations involved will do the same. So there it is. Hitler straight up said, we'll get rid of our entire military, what's left of it, if our neighbors do the same. And of course, that didn't fit the agenda because Germany had just kicked the Rothschilds out and the other Jew bankers had been removed from control of the German government. So the Jews needed war to retake power in Germany. And so this is why all of the puppet governments around Germany would not disarm as Germany wished to do. Anyhow. But if the other states are unwilling to implement the conditions of disarmament the peace treaty of Versailles obligates to them, then Germany must at least insist on her right to parity. So basically, Hitler was just insisting that all of the countries do what they promised to do in the Versailles Treaty. He was willing to abide by the Versailles Treaty in the arena of military disarmament if the other countries did. And they wouldn't do it because they demanded war to restore the Jew banks to Germany, and also Jewish control of the media. Hitler stopped the transsexual surgery places and all that stuff that the Jews had set up in Germany. He shut down the porn industry. Hitler removed the Jew bankers from power. He restored power to the people and increased their standard of living by 300% in something like 9 years. So the Jew bankers had to put a stop to this. They had to strangle Germany to death in front of all the other nations, so they needed a conflict, and that's why all the puppet governments would not give Germany the satisfaction of seeing them abide by their part of the Versailles Treaty's obligations. Anyhow, the German government sees in the English plan a possible basis to solve these questions. Germany therefore agrees in essence to accept a transitional period of 5 years for the establishment of her national security in the expectation that Germany's equal footing with the other states will result. So this is the opposite of Hitler being a warmonger. He wanted to disband his entire military. Hitler wanted to disband the entire military and tried to convince his neighbors to do that too. This is just amazing, the level of Jewish perfidy that we get in the schools. Hitler was not a warmonger, he was an economic reformer. And a Greek philosopher. Moving on. The only objection to MacDonald's proposal Hitler posed was that his country should be permitted to develop an air force. Since the 1932 Reichswehr plan envisioned a maximum of just 200 planes by 1938, this was a minor exception. The Führer's acceptance of the MacDonald Plan meant leaving Germany virtually defenseless for nearly 5 years, basing national security purely on the good faith of neighboring powers to honor the agreement, an obligation which they had not met so far. Even after the 5-year period, the Reichswehr would be heavily outnumbered and outgunned. As Hitler pointed out in his speech, quote, "The only nation justified in fearing an invasion is Germany," end quote. Hitler's approval of the MacDonald Plan received mixed reviews. The chairman of the conference, Arthur Henderson, stated on May 19th that Hitler's speech clearly demonstrates that Germany's desire to achieve balance rests not with expanding the Reichswehr, but with multilateral disarmament. And by the way, if you look at chapter 1 and 2 again, you'll see that Germany was not producing any arms. So not only was Hitler not planning on increasing the size of his military, he had not even done anything to make his industry gear up towards weapons manufacture. So we're moving on here. As Hitler pointed out in his speech, the only nation justified in fearing an invasion is Germany. Let's see. Anthony Eden, representing Britain in Geneva, called the speech encouraging. The American delegate, Norman Davis, declared his country's readiness to accept MacDonald's proposal. Only France reacted unfavorably. At the session in Geneva on May 23rd, the French delegate, Paul Boncourt, insisted that Germany's political organizations, the Stahlhelm, Steel Helmets, SA, and SS, represent a military fighting force augmenting the size of the German army by nearly 1 million men. Here, Tador made a typo. It says the size of the Germany army, so he's got an extra Y in there. He needs to get rid of the Y at the end of Germany and make it German army. Anyhow, moving on. In his May 17th speech, Hitler defended the Stahlhelm as a veteran society, preserving the comradeship forged during World War I. Its members had helped quell communist uprisings in the Reich from 1919 to 1923. He added, quote, "In a few years, the SA and SS lost over 350 dead and 40,000 injured as a result of communist murder attempts and terrorism. If Geneva counts these organizations serving an exclusively internal political purpose as part of the army, Then the fire department, athletic associations, police societies, gun lodges, sailing clubs, and other sports leagues might as well also be considered armed forces, end quote. So Hitler had a real sense of humor in these international conferences, and this is how he won over Chamberlain and a lot of other countries that were willing to listen to him. And it's such a shame that Henry Ford was not our ambassador to Germany. Oh well. Hitler, in fact, had no interest in militarizing the party's affiliates. The Stahlhelm soon all but disappeared, and the SA chief Ernst Röhm caused so much trouble demanding that his stormtroopers, not the army, take over national defense that Hitler had him shot a year later. So basically the people that were trying to make the anti-communist street groups that had stopped the Jewish Bolsheviks' revolution in Germany, thus saving millions of Germans' lives, the people that wanted to make them into actual military units were lined up and shot. So Hitler was doing everything he could, including stopping people that wanted to militarize, to show the world that he wanted peace and that he was a man of peace. Anyhow, during a recess at Geneva, a French statesman conducted confidential deliberations with England and the United States regarding the MacDonald Plan. Supported by the French press, Paris advocated a minimum 4-year period before even initiating multilateral disarmament. The German army, they recommended, should be restructured, replacing the present system of long-term enlistment with an active duty tour of 8 months for every soldier. Under this arrangement, the Reichswehr would forfeit in less than a year its professional officer corps and NCO cadre of instructors. On October 7th, the German government announced its acceptance of the proposal. The Reich agreed not to develop offensive weapons such as heavy artillery, bombers, and heavy tanks. With the exception of a demand for modern defensive weaponry, Hitler voluntarily agreed to the reshaping of his country's armed forces by a foreign power. So, this is pretty obvious. Hitler is doing everything he can to not let the Jew bankers get their war. But of course, the puppet governments that the Jews still controlled were making sure there was going to be war, which you're about to see. 1 week later, a British delegate, Sir John Simon, announced revisions to the MacDonald Plan based on consultation with other nations. He extended the original 5-year disarmament period, which Hitler had already accepted, to 8 years. The new arrangement expressly forbade all signatories from producing more weapons. The Germans, therefore, would not have the right to sufficiently arm the additional 100,000 soldiers the plan allowed for. Germany withdrew from the conference the same day and from the League of Nations. So basically, they got Germany to agree to something where Germany was getting screwed, and then after Germany agreed, they screwed Germany even harder, and Hitler realized this is a slippery slope. They are setting us up for an invasion. Basically, they want us not to say anything while all of the surrounding countries that are controlled by Jew banks, increase their armaments in preparation for an invasion of Germany under some pretext. And so Hitler walked away realizing, oh shit, they're trying to trick me into getting rid of the last little bit of military Germany still has. So Hitler stopped with the international disarmament conferences and kept his military small and focused on economic reform, as it's going to show. But I'm going to move on here. Despite the concessions Hitler had offered, he reaped harsh criticism from the international press, which we all know who controls that, right guys? As Freitag Loringhofen summarized, quote, most of its readers must have gained the impression that Germany frivolously sabotaged all of the grand work toward disarmament, and by withdrawing from the Geneva League of Nations, parted ways with the community of civilized states, end quote. America's new president, Franklin Roosevelt, had already told a German emissary that he considered Germany, quote, Germany the only possible obstacle to disarmament treaty, end quote. The military advisor with the English delegation to the disarmament conference sent a report to the Foreign Office in London describing Hitler as, quote, a mad dog running around loose, end quote, who needs to be, quote, either destroyed or locked away, end quote. So just these are quotes from Jewish newspapermen, Jewish liaisons to the Shabbos Goyim governments, and pretty much other Shabbos Goyim, just saying a bunch of shit that wasn't true about Hitler. The permanent undersecretary In the Foreign Office, Robert Vansittart added a note of approval to the document and distributed copies to the staff. French newspapers published bogus reports of secret German war plans. Le Journal in Paris described how Stahlhelm SS and SA men received extensive combat training from the Reichswehr, which is not true, by the way. Explaining Germany's withdrawal from Geneva on October 14th, Hitler reminded his countrymen how the Allies had pledged in their own peace treaty to reduce their military establishments. Quote, and this is Hitler's words, "Our delegates were then told by official representatives of the other states in public speeches and direct declarations that at the present time Germany could no longer be granted equal rights," end quote. The Führer maintained that, quote, "the German people and their government were repeatedly humiliated," end quote. During the negotiations, he concluded that this, quote, "world peace, so ultimately necessary for all of us, can only be achieved when the concepts of victor and vanquished are supplanted by the loftier vision of the equal rights to life for everyone," end quote. Wow. I mean, this certainly doesn't fit the Hollywood version of Hitler I grew up learning about. Seems like this guy just wanted equal rights. Anyhow. Conscious of the gravity of this foreign policy decision, Hitler presented it to the German public for approval. He asked Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg to authorize new parliamentary elections coupled with a referendum on Geneva. The Führer repeated his position on the League to employees of the Siemens factory in Berlin on November 10th, and the national radio broadcasted that speech. In the referendum 2 days later, 95% of German voters endorsed the Chancellor's break with Geneva. So this was, the whole country said, this is bullcrap, we're getting screwed, let's leave this. This is kind of like what the Jews are doing with Iran. But we're moving on now. Even after leaving the League that October, Hitler still sought rapprochement. In January 1934, he petitioned Geneva to approve a 300,000-man army for his country. The British government asked him to settle for a force somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 instead. Hitler agreed. France's foreign minister, Jean-Louis Barthot, insisted that the SA could be counted as part of Germany's army. The Führer expressed willingness to eliminate the SA's paramilitary structure. He stood firm for an air force, but pledged not to expand its size beyond 50% of that of France. He completely renounced German development of bombers. Hitler was content to wait 5 years for the great powers to begin arms reduction, if France would accept the proposals. So at this point, it looks like Hitler understands what's going on, and he has to show the world that he's not the one who wants an arms race. And so he offers even self-hamstringing proposals where Germany would have no chance of defending itself with even tiny amounts of military, and so long as the quote-unquote allies decided to disarm as well. And they wouldn't do it. This theme is going to be continued throughout the book, and it's going to bring a tear to your eye when you see just how bad the Jewish-controlled government screwed over Germany and tried to entrap Germany into a war. I think it was only like the 8th time they ambushed Germany that Germany actually walked into a war, but we'll get to that later. I'm going to take a brief break here, and I will be back in about 5 minutes with more from Chapter 3 of Hitler's Revolution. I'm going to leave you with some music here.
Auf
back. I like that song. It's about a plague on board a ship, and how the water became infected with some type of contagion, and just everyone taking a break and singing about how much they miss home and their women and such. And that's pretty much all German military songs. It's just singing about the hometown or the home city, and really just being homesick. Very wholesome, family-oriented songs, those German seamen songs, sea shanties, and military marches. But we're going to get back. Let me click the record button on my offline recording, and I'm making an offline recording too. And if you go to littlerevolution.us, I am trying to raise contributions so I can fund activism over the summer related to my campaign. So we're going to go out and try and gather up those signature gathering organizations to get me on the ballot in all 50 states. So here we go with more of Hitler's Revolution, continuing chapter 3. Okay. Many prominent Frenchmen endorsed the compromise. The novelist Alphonse de Chateaubriand, I can't speak French, observed, quote, "Germany neither seeks war with France nor considers it," end quote. Henri Pichot stated, quote, "The youth who did not experience the war don't know what war is. It's up to us to tell them. It is our duty. And all of those we fought to build bridges across the trenches that still divide us," end quote. So these are people in France that were speaking out against the Jew-controlled French government's warpath that it was on. So France's ambassador in Berlin, Francois Poncet, supported the compromise with Germany. French statesman André Tardieu told him, quote, "You're wasting your time. The agreement you advocate will never be concluded. We'll never sign it. Hitler won't be at the helm much longer. When war breaks out, a week won't pass before he's ousted and replaced by the Crown Prince," end quote. So here were the plans. Here other people in the French government are admitting that there was no chance of peace with Germany, that Germany would be invaded. This is like the Jewish State Department with the Jew puppet Hillary Clinton announcing that they were going to destroy anyone who didn't have a Jew central bank, including Gaddafi. The parallels with the last few decades of our State Department and these Jew-controlled State Departments and foreign ministries is just, it's uncanny. It's disturbing how history just keeps on repeating itself when you leave Jews in control of your government. Anyhow, on April 17th, 1934, Barthot issued an official reply to the British mediation plan and Hitler's offer. Quote, "The French government formally refuses to allow Germany to rearm. From now on, France will guarantee her security through her own resources," end quote. This caused the collapse of the Geneva Disarmament Conference. So basically, the Jew-controlled governments would not allow for peace with Germany, would not allow for disarmament. This is exactly like when Saddam Hussein was trying desperately to keep the peace in 2002, 3, and 4, and the Jews just kept on making ridiculous accusations at any pretense they could get just to invade Iraq, which eventually happened, I believe, on the first day of Purim. Or was that the first Iraq War? I don't remember. Anyhow, moving on. France. Bordering France, the Saar is a 741 square mile German mining region just south of Luxembourg. During the 1919 peace conference, France sought to annex the Saar. Clemenceau falsely claimed that the province's ethnic French colony numbered 150,000. He protested that a post-war German administration of the Saar would rob the inhabitants of the opportunity to, quote, "to enjoy the freedom the French government wants to give them," end quote. So this is a German region with just a sprinkling of a few Frenchmen in it, and it was taken from Germany on this pretense. Wilson and Lloyd George, however, arranged for the region to come under League of Nations jurisdiction for 15 years. The population could then vote whether the Saar should return to Germany, join France, or maintain status quo. So basically they made a UN-administered region and or a League of Nations administered region, and then there would be a referendum whether the people of the Saar, which were almost entirely German, wanted to reunify with their father country. So, from 1920 to 1935, the five-member Saar Commission governed the region. French became the official language in public schools. The German minors opted for their own ethnic schools. German society supported their children's education through traveling libraries, delivering German language study books to even remote villages. The French arrested Hermann Röchling, a publisher and sponsor of the program. Violating the Versailles Treaty, Paris transferred 5,000 soldiers to the Saar. They expelled most of the German civil servants and replaced them with French officials. The French assumed control of the coal industry. Political analysts, German and French alike, predicted that the overwhelming majority of voters would cast for reunion with Germany in the 1935 plebiscite, which is like a referendum. Paris encouraged the population to vote for status quo. This would deprive Hitler of a strategic buffer dividing the two powers. France recruited German communists, former trade union officials, and other opponents of the Hitler administration who had migrated to the Saar in 1933 to campaign for status quo. Their propaganda vehemently criticized National Socialism. So this is like, think of the Brexit thing. Even after it got voted for, they're still trying to stop it. It's the will of the people. The will of the people. The Jew-controlled governments will never let it be exercised so long as they're still in power. The media campaign marred Franco-German relations. Hitler expressed his concern in a well-publicized interview on November 24, 1934, with the chairman of the Union of French Front Fighters, Jean Goy. This guy's name is literally Goy. So Hitler had a conference with a guy named Goy. This has got to be good. And Goy says, quote, "The French press draws the conclusion that," Hitler said to Goy, quote, "The French press draws the conclusion that we Germans are preparing a coup. It's pure insanity to think that Germany would want to disrupt the coming plebiscite by resorting to force. We will accept the results of the plebiscite no matter how it turns out." End quote. Hitler added that he had once suggested to Barthot that the pair draft a joint protocol to regulate, quote, "eventual difficulties," end quote, "that might surface," quote, "but never received an answer," end quote. So, pretty insane. So Germany just wanted the region to vote whether it wanted to rejoin Germany, and they were willing to do anything to make sure that it was a fair and open referendum, or plebiscite as they called it. And then there's a picture from a Jewish newspaper article that in the French language, and it shows a picture of a giant ape with like a very savage face on it, with the Hakenkreuz on a shield holding a Frenchman in its arm, and there's a caption: "France's attitude toward Germany during the 1930s opposed reconciliation. A French magazine in Alsace-Lorraine depicted the German as a savage primate who would wreak havoc if released from the cage of Versailles." So I'm sure that was probably a Jewish artist who drew that. But so Hitler proposed canceling the plebiscite in favor of a more cordial settlement. The Saar would return to Germany. The French industry would retain control of its coal-rich natural resources. This was a magnanimous gesture, considering that Hitler expected to carry the vote. Hundreds of thousands of Saar residents had crossed into Germany in special trains and motor columns to attend his campaign speech in Koblenz the previous August. Paris rejected the proposal. I used to live near Koblenz for a while, by the way. Supervised by the League of Nations, the plebiscite took place on January 13, 1935. The result was a landslide, with 90.8% of the voters casting for union with Germany, 8.8% favoring status quo, and just 2,124 out of 500,857 eligible voters opting for France. So France, the Jew-controlled government of France, did not get even 1/45 the support that Germany got in this plebiscite. With the plebiscite settled, Hitler hoped for better relations with France. He had already renounced any future claims to Alsace-Lorraine. This was a large frontier region of mixed heritage which Germany had annexed from France in 1871. Clemenceau reclaimed the territory after 1918. Hitler explained to John Goy in 1934, quote, "It would be no solution to wage war every 20 or 30 years to take back province that always cause France problems when they're French and Germany when they're German." I'll read that again. It would be no solution to wage war every 20 or 30 years to take back provinces that always cause France problems when they're French and Germany when they're German. So there's Hitler's wit, once again, sharp as a knife. In his official proclamation announcing the recovery of the Saar, he described it as, quote, "a decisive step on the road to reconciliation," end quote, with France. On March 6, the French reacted to the Saar plebiscite by extending military enlistments to 2 years. Soldiers scheduled for discharge remained on active duty, gradually expanding the size of the armed forces. Paris then announced a proposed mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union. This would pledge military support in case a signatory, quote, "is exposed to threat or danger of attack from a European state," end quote. With 45 French army divisions already stationed near Germany's frontier, Hitler announced on March 16th that his government would no longer comply with the Versailles armament restrictions. He introduced compulsory military service with 1-year enlistments. So in other words, France started ramping up its military, and the writing was on the wall. Hitler had seen the reports from people in the French government guaranteeing that there would be war with Germany to restore the Jew central bank. And, well, Hitler said he's not going to go down without a fight, but he wouldn't start it. And here is, once again, someone other than Germany casting the first stone. This happens a lot. You're going to see this a lot in this book. So, moving on. Hitler summoned Dr. Friedrich Grimm, an authority in international law, to the Chancellery. The Führer was preparing his Reichstag speech to justify instituting the draft. He asked his guests, were you in my place? How would you explain the legal issue? Grimm replied, "We're in the right. According to the Versailles Treaty, the obligation to disarm is a mutual legal obligation. We've already done so. We've disarmed. This the opponents officially acknowledge, but they have not followed with their own disarmament. They're in arrears. Germany therefore demands freedom of action. It's amazing that the Reichsgovernment was so patient and accepted this circumstance for over 15 years, end quote. Just a moment, I gotta turn off a fan. In his Reichstag speech of March 21st, 1935, Hitler announced his intention to build an armed force that was not an instrument of belligerent attack, but exclusively for defense, and in this way to maintain peace. End quote. He included a renewed, fruitless proposal for all industrial nations to outlaw aerial bombardment and limit naval armaments, heavy artillery, and armor. The German diplomat Joachim von Ribbentrop met with Grimm at the Kaiserhof Hotel in Berlin. Hitler wished to promote better relations through the German-French Society, founded in 1934 with its sister association in France, the Comité France-Allemagne. Ribbentrop, oh, by the way, when I was at Gymnasium in Germany, this society still existed that Hitler had set up, friendship between Germany and France. Ribbentrop asked that Grimm become president of the Berlin-based society, a post he accepted. The German government sponsored the activities with financial aid, while the French counterpart had to rely on private contributions in its own country. So basically, the Germans set up a friendship organization with France, and they funded with the government, and the French side of it, which the people wanted, had to be privately funded because a Jew-run government would not allow it to be funded by the state. The Franco-Soviet agreement tarnished relations between Paris and Berlin. On May 25th, the Germans protested that it violated the 1925 Locarno Pact. In this compact, France Belgium and Germany pledged under no circumstances to attack, fall upon, or wage war against one another. The German government argued that the Franco-Soviet understanding was directed against the Reich. In January 1936, Hitler attempted again to persuade France to change course by offering a non-aggression pact. Paris refused. The French described their arrangement with the USSR as purely political and not a military alliance, hence not repugnant to the spirit of Locarno. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. In February, however, Soviet Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky met in Paris with General Maurice Gamelin, commander-in-chief of the French army. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, learned that the French General Staff was preparing a plan to coordinate operations with the Red Army. The blueprint envisioned a French advance into the demilitarized Rhineland together with a thrust further south to link up with the Soviet forces invading Germany from the east. So the plan was to invade Germany as early as 1936. And the Jews that controlled the French government at the time, as well as the Jews who ran the Soviet Union, were planning this together. Hitler granted a cordial interview to the French journalist Bertrand de Jouvenel in mid-February at Berchtesgaden. German newspapers published the interview on the front page, including Hitler's retractions of anti-French statements he previously wrote in Mein Kampf. The German diplomat Otto Abdes, who had arranged the Jouvenel interview, delivered a copy of it to Paris. The French press delayed publication until after the Chamber of Deputies ratified the Franco-Soviet Pact on February 27th. The following morning, the Jouvenel interview appeared in the Paris Midi. Had the French public read Hitler's placatory comments sooner, this might have cast doubt on France's need for a security pact with the USSR. Publishing the interview after its ratification gave the appearance that fear, not goodwill, had prompted Hitler's offer of friendship. The French newspaper Ouvre, I don't know how to speak French, even wrote that the Führer gave the interview after the Soviet treaty's ratification. The affair left Hitler mortified and angry. Who wouldn't be pissed? This is some Jewish tricks right here. Informed of the Franco-Soviet General Staff talks, the Führer became concerned that the demilitarized Rhineland represented an open door for France to invade. He responded by transferring 19 infantry battalions to garrison Aachen, Saarbrücken, and Trier, and then other Rhineland cities. He publicly withdrew Germany from the Locarno Pact, by which the Reich had agreed to keep the province free of troops. So, 19 battalions would be greatly outnumbered by the number of French they had stationed across the border. But yeah, that's Hitler just saying, oh crap, the Jews are getting ready to invade. Let's make sure that it's not an open door. The Reich's Foreign Office pointed out that France already maintained military alliances with Belgium, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. She already constructed a formidable line of frontier fortifications bordering Germany, concentrating an erroneous mass of troops there. An enormous mass of troops there. France, nonetheless, still feels it necessary to have to rely on the support of the huge Soviet Empire, and Germany has never provided the remotest grounds for France to feel threatened. Paris describes the 19 battalions entering the Rhineland as a threat to French security, which is guaranteed by practically half the world. And these were quotes. Let's see. I don't know who those are quotes from, that's not clear. Anyhow, Hitler proposed that both France and Germany withdraw military units from borderline areas, and that Belgium, Germany, and France conclude a 25-year non-aggression pact and establish an international court of arbitration to enforce compacts, quote, whose decisions shall be binding on all parties, end quote. The Reich offered to return to the League of Nations for a new multilateral disarmament conference. The proposal stated, quote, Germany and France pledge to take steps to see that regarding the education of the young, as well as in the press and publications of both nations, everything shall be avoided which might be calculated to poison the relationship between the two peoples, end quote. Basically, Hitler was saying, not only do I want peace, but here I'll prove it to you by showing that I'm not teaching the kids to be anti-French if you just stop letting the Jews print these anti-German pieces designed to incite the French against the Germans. So, from 1932 to 1936, the German government introduced from 1932 to 1936, the German government introduced 7 proposals to limit or reduce world armaments. In none of these did the Reich demand parity. Hitler offered to maintain an air force half the size of France's and was prepared to accept a national defense force vastly inferior to the combined strength of surrounding countries allied to one another. He appealed to the great powers to abolish offensive weapons and outlaw aerial bombardment. He was the only European leader willing to entrust the security of his nation to the good faith of neighboring states, an astonishing concession for an industrial power. None of Germany's proposals kindled interest among the former enemy coalition. It pursued an escalating arms race and denounced Hitler as a warmonger. Next section is called Austria. Sorry, I'm a little sick. You can hear my nose is stuffy. Austria-Hungary, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, had been Germany's ally during World War I. In 1919, the victorious powers dismembered this vast motley empire. Hungary and Czechoslovakia became independent countries. Other components fell to Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Italy. Multiple cultures often populated each region. It was impossible to apportion provinces to their respective new countries without placing some of the ethnic colonies inhabiting them under the domination. It was impossible to apportion provinces to their respective new countries without placing some of the ethnic colonies inhabiting them under the dominion of the prevailing foreign nationality. Austria, the nucleus of the old realm, shrunk from sovereignty over nearly 30 million people to a diminutive, landlocked republic of 6,500,000 persons. Southern and Eastern Europe's smaller nations had traditionally belonged to larger empires. The decision to establish independent states for them conformed to Wilson's proclaimed ideal of self-determination, the right of every people to govern themselves. U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing interpreted Wilson's cartographic experiment as follows. Quote, if the right of self-determination were sound in principle and uniformly applicable in establishing political allegiance and territorial sovereignty, the endeavor of the Southern states to secede from the American Union in 1861 would have been wholly justifiable. End quote. On November 12, 1918, Austria's Provisional National Assembly declared its country a component of the German Republic. It officially adopted the name German Austria. It contradicted the Allied objective of eliminating the former Central Power as a future rival. To sanction the Austrian-German Union would have helped restore the Reich to its pre-war magnitude. It would also have facilitated German economic influence in the Balkan and Danube regions. Allied delegates at the peace conference informed Austria that she must, quote, abstain from any act which might directly or indirectly or by any means whatsoever compromise her independence. Gee, this is just crazy. Anyhow, moving on. It also forbade the country from using the name German Austria. Chancellor Karl Renner protested to the Allies that this violates the population's right to self-determination, to which they responded that this right does not extend to defeated enemy countries. Britain forced Vienna to comply by threatening to resume the blockade of her foodstuffs. God. So, any countries the Jews don't want to have self-determination won't have it. This is insane. It gets worse. Let's keep going. Post-war Austria became the only part of the former Habsburg realm from which the Entente demanded reparations. So basically, Austro-Hungary was at war in World War I. They were the first ones to really do an offensive operation. It was Austro-Hungary. It's so pretty much, half of southeastern Europe was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the only people that had to pay reparations were the German part of Austria. You understand now, when the Jews were talking about in the 19th century annihilating the German people, this was a deep-seated hatred. They hated the Germans. They saw them as potential rivals that could challenge Jewish world domination. The Jews had wanted all the Germans dead for a very long time. And so we're moving on here. Post-war Austria became the only part of the former Habsburg realm from which the Entente demanded reparations. Deprived of its industrial base, which fell to Czechoslovakia, Hungary's agrarian economy, and the Danube export market, this was catastrophic for the little country. Discharged soldiers and German-speaking civil servants from the lost provinces returned to the homeland unable to find work. Unemployment rose to 557,000. So they stripped the German part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of pretty much all of its economy. This is ethnic hatred. This is Jewish. Moving on. Most Austrians favored unification with Germany. Hitler, reared in Linz, shared this sentiment. In April 1934, he assigned the Reichsforeign Office to prepare a report defining policy. Regarding possible annexation of the country, the report opined that, quote, German efforts in this direction will be frustrated by the unanimous resistance of all European great powers, end quote. In a German Reichstag speech in May, Hitler declared, quote, the German people and the German government have, out of the simple feeling of solidarity toward common national heritage, the understandable wish that not just foreign peoples, but also German people everywhere will be guaranteed the right to self-determination, end quote. And what happened to the Germans then is happening to all white people now. White people are not allowed to have governments. They're not allowed to say what happens to their countries. And that everything is taken from them economically. It's arguable that Kissinger concluding the slave labor pact with China, allowing all American industry to be destroyed by China's communist slave workforce with free trade with a country that uses slavery, China. This is similar to Germany and Austria being stripped of their industries and their resources after World War I. I'll get into that another time. I'll do a whole show on Henry Kissinger and other Jews have been planning the destruction of the American economy for a very long time, in case white genocide isn't completed here. But I'll move on to that another time. The Austrian government had become a dictatorship. In 1931, the country elected Engelbert Dollfuss Bundeskanzler, or national chancellor. He dissolved the parliament in 1933. So this is, by the way, Dollfuss was fully supported by the Jews. The Jews set up a dictator in Austria to try and, hey, we're the globo homo version of an authoritarian government, and we're not going to join Austria because, we're just so cool over here, and we support the Rothschilds that are still in our country. And so this was a puppet government of the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds were so confident that the dictator they set up in Austria would be able to keep the Austrians from unifying with Germany that when Hitler peacefully entered Austria, these arrogant Rothschilds were still there, expecting their puppet government to stand, which it did not, but we'll get to that. Moving on. The Austrian government had become a dictatorship. In 1931, the country elected Engelbert Dollfuss Bundeskanzler, or national chancellor. He dissolved parliament in 1933, founded the Fatherland Front, and prescribed other political parties. Dollfuss established detention camps in September with corralled members of Communist and National Socialist parties. Dollfuss reinstituted the death penalty. The following February, he ordered the police to disarm the Social Democrats' Defense League. This led to armed resistance in Vienna and in Linz. Dollfuss deployed the army, which bombarded workers' housing districts in the capital with artillery. Over 300 people died in the fighting. Having suppressed the revolt, he banned the Social Democrat Party, abolished the trade unions, and hanged 11 Defense League members. The Bantam dictator died in July 1934 during an equally abortive coup staged by Vienna's National Socialist Underground. Minister of Justice Kurt Schuschnigg replaced Dollfuss. Under the new chancellor, 13 of the conspirators received death sentences based on a proposed statute not signed into law until the day after their execution. So if you're a Jew-backed government, you get to do whatever you want. There's no such thing as legality. The police arrested the chief defense attorney 3 days later after the trial. Without a hearing, he spent the next 6 months in the Vollersdorf detention camp. I have trouble switching between German and English. But so this is just like Sylvia Stoltz. She got prison time for being the attorney for someone accused of Holocaust denial. This is the same thing. Under the Jew puppet government before World War II, things were similar in German-speaking Austria as they are now in all of Germany and Austria. Show trials or lack of trials or laws passed that you're hung with. The laws are passed after they execute you or after they imprison you. It's what do you call it? Retroactively applying new laws. Yeah. Anyhow, having attained power without a single vote, Schuschnigg relied on the Fatherland Front to maintain the dictatorship. Political dissidents lumped together as national opposition landed in concentration camps. Documented cases of inmate abuse included confinement without trial, house arrest for prisoners' relatives, 2 or more trials and sentences for the same crime, convictions and fines without evidence, the presumption of guilt until proven innocent, withholding medical care from inmates who were ill, sometimes resulting in death, and forced confessions. The regime denied persons of, quote, deficient civic reliability, quote, the right to practice their occupation. This sounds pretty similar to nowadays, huh? Schuschnigg judicially persecuted Austrians who favored unification with the Reich. The verdict often fell on members of choral societies and sports clubs nurturing cultural ties with Germany. Quote, suspicion of nationalistic convictions, end quote, cost civil servants their jobs. This included forfeiture of pensions and loss of unemployment compensation. So economic warfare was declared on any Germans of German Austria that wanted to unite with the German Empire. This is divide and conquer, and they used tyranny, the puppet government of the Rothschilds, Schuschnigg, to do it. And who was really behind this was the Jew bankers that didn't want Austrian Germans joining with the other Germans. And Austrian Germans are almost identical to Bavarian Germans. The way they talk, the way they act, a lot of the way they look. It's a very similar culture. Anyhow, the dictator sought an alliance with Italy to support Austrian sovereignty. The Italian head of state, Benito Mussolini, anticipated that an Austrian-German union would jeopardize his country's control of southern Tyrol. By the way, side note, southern Tyrol was awarded to Italy at the end of World War I, even though it's all German. It's still Italian. It's still under Italian control today, but they speak German and Südtirol, Southern Tyrol. The Entente had awarded this province, populated by 250,000 ethnic Germans, to Italy after World War I. During Dollfuss's tenure, Mussolini had supported aid to Austria. The new Bundeskanzler failed to maintain the good relationship that Dollfuss had cultivated with Rome. The vivacious Mussolini did not relate well to the austere, impersonal Schuschnigg. The Austrian government's human rights violations alienated France and Czechoslovakia. The Italian-German dissonance that Schuschnigg hoped to capitalize on diminished in 1936. When Italy invaded Abyssinia, she was able to defy League of Nations sanctions through Hitler's economic support. Mussolini advised Schuschnigg to normalize relations with Germany. Basically, Mussolini realized that Schuschnigg was a dictator and bad, and that Hitler was, someone that was very fair to his people and good to his workers, as described in the previous chapters. So, basically, he was saying, stand aside. Your people want to join Germany, let them. And this is a similar situation with Austria and Germany in the 1930s with Italy there. Kind of similar to what the Jews are doing with Ukraine, where they overthrew the government that was friendly with Russia, and they now have a Jew Globo Homo, where they're doing cuck commercials in Ukraine now. Yeah, the cuck commercials where the white guy's getting cucked by some random replacement population guy are now in full swing in Ukraine. That's why they had the whole revolution. What was it, in 2014? This is similar to the government being against the will of the people in Austria now. Ukraine is ruled by a puppet government of the Jew bankers the same way as Austria was then. And luckily, Italy saw through the Jewish tricks and decided to stop propping up the stupid government of Austria that was tyrannical. And hopefully, the United States and Russia can step over the stumbling blocks set in front of them by the Jews trying to cause a conflict in Eastern Europe. So, moving on here. I'm sorry, you can hear my nose is clogged. I'm a little sick here. So, Hitler, unjustly blamed for the 1934 coup to topple Dollfuss, sought to break the diplomatic deadlock. He appointed Franz von Papen, a conservative aristocrat distant to National Socialism and a devout Catholic, special ambassador to Vienna. Papen presented Austrian Foreign Minister Egon Berger with the draft for an Austrian-German, quote, gentleman's agreement. The compact corroborated Hitler's strategy for incorporating Austria as an evolutionary process promoting economic and cultural ties between both countries. The preamble stated, quote, the German Reichsgovernment recognizes the complete sovereignty of the Austrian national state, end quote. It bound Germany not to interfere in Austria's internal political affairs. In return, the preamble obligated Schuschnigg, quote, with respect to the German Reich, to maintain a basic position that conforms to the fact that Austria sees herself as a German state, end quote. The document requires that, quote, all decisive elements for shaping public opinion in both countries shall serve the purpose of developing mutual relations which are once again normal and friendly, end quote. The agreement offered general guidelines for promoting commerce, such as lifting restrictions on travel and trade across the frontier. Schuschnigg agreed to allow members of the, quote, national opposition, end quote, to participate in government. He released 15,583 political prisoners. Many were National Socialists whom Hitler arranged to resettle in Germany. Upon the Führer's insistence, Schuschnigg relaxed restrictions on the press. An important element of the agreement stipulated, quote, both governments will exchange views in foreign policy matters that affect both countries, end quote. Papen and Schuschnigg signed the agreement in Vienna on July 11, 1936. Germany's assurance to respect Austrian independence drew praise from the international press, even in France. Hitler summoned Joseph Leopold, leader of the Austrian National Socialists, and instructed him to take the new treaty, quote, very seriously. The Führer warned Leopold that he wanted no encore of the 1934 coup. Quote, the Austrian National Socialists must maintain exemplary discipline and regard unification as an internal German matter, a solution to which can only be found within the scope of negotiations between Berlin and Vienna, end quote. Hitler was hopeful, thanks in part to Schuschnigg's encouraging remark that Austrian-German unification was, quote, an attainable political objective for the future, end quote. And you're going to see how this is just him reacting to Mussolini pulling the rug out from him in terms of propping him up. He will go back and backpedal on all this and start imprisoning people again. And he'll even try to arrange a fake referendum in which you're only allowed to vote to not join Germany. But you have to vote. In which case, all votes would have to be against unification. But that's coming later in the book. Let's see. Europe was in the age of nationalism. The average Austrian rejected Schuschnigg's liberal perception of Austria as a universal realm transcending ethnic roots and customs. Oh, jeez. The Jews never stop trying to push this. They always try and say, we're the only real nation, the only real tribe, the rest of you are just goyim, and you're not allowed to have identity, because it makes you resistant to our tyranny. God, nothing ever changes. except who's in power, which we need to change. Vote Little in 2020. While the country wallowed in the throe of economic depression, commerce in the Reich flourished. Unification with Germany promised employment and prosperity. Schuschnigg was himself a dictator. He could not argue that incorporating his country into the German authoritarian state would cost Austrians their liberties. England and France showed no interest in guaranteeing a country that flouted democratic principles. In an atmosphere of internal unrest and diplomatic isolation, the Bundeskanzler turned again to Germany. So basically, Austria was an authoritarian state, but it pushed globo homo and pretty much put you in jail if you said that, Austria is Austrian, which is German, and that we have the right to a national identity. It's crazy. This is the same stuff that gets you thrown in jail in Germany nowadays if you say that Germany's for Germans and not an open society. It's crazy. Nothing ever changes with these people. Moving on. Hitler invited Schuschnigg to meet at the Berghof on February 12, 1938. The Führer hoped to get Austrian-German relations back on track toward unification as an evolutionary process. A member of Austria's, quote, national opposition, quote, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, prepared a list of proposals for Schuschnigg as a basis for negotiations in Berchtesgaden. I always have trouble with that name. These included bringing political opponents into the government. Informed of the proposals, Hitler prepared his own list. The 10 German proposals, among others, called for joint consultation in the foreign policy matters mutually affecting Austria and Germany, amnesty for political prisoners, pensions for dismissed civil servants, and legalization of the National Socialist Party in Austria. They demanded freedom of the press and preparations to merge the two countries' economic systems. The last would be particularly beneficial to the Austrian population. The list recommended several names, none of them hardline National Socialists, for cabinet posts, including Seyss-Inquart. Point 8 proposed a military officers exchange program, joint general staff conferences promoting camaraderie and sharing knowledge in weapons development. Schuschnigg attended the Berchtesgaden session with his military adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Bartel, and Guido Schmidt. During the initial private session between the two heads of state, Schuschnigg became defensive and asserted that it was he, not Hitler, who represented Austria. Hitler, born an Austrian, retorted, quote, "Just once try holding a free election in Austria with you and I opposing each other as candidates, then we'll see," end quote. It's pretty good. During parallel talks between Guido Schmidt and Germany's newly appointed foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Austrian government won significant concessions. It reduced the obligation to joint consultation on foreign policy matters to, quote, an exchange of thoughts, end quote. It limited the political activity of National Socialists in Austria. Hitler agreed to publicly condemn illegal acts such as sabotage of his followers there. The Führer approved Vienna's request that aggressive National Socialists be relocated to Germany. The Germans withdrew those candidates suggested for Austrian cabinet posts that Schuschnigg objected to. Berlin abandoned its plan for a joint economic system and reduced the scope of military cooperation. At the conclusion of the conference, Hitler told Schuschnigg, quote, "This is the best way. The Austrian question is regulated for the next 5 years." End quote. Newspapers in England, France, and the USA claimed that Hitler presented his demands as an ultimatum, intimidated Schuschnigg by inviting 3 German generals to the conference, and threatened invasion if the Bundeskanzler failed to sign. The fact that the Austrians negotiated significant modifications demonstrates that Germany's proposals were not an ultimatum. The generals attended to provide consultation on questions of integrating the two countries' armed forces. Schuschnigg brought along his own military advisor. Guido Schmidt testified later that he had no recollection of German threat to invade Austria. Papen stated that it was his impression that that Schuschnigg enjoyed full freedom of decision throughout the sessions. The Bundeskanzler confessed that he had been under considerable mental stress, but nothing more. The British ambassador to Austria, Sir Charles Palaret, reported to London on a number of initial demands which Hitler withdrew. He confirmed that Schmidt told him nothing of German threats. Palaret cited Hitler's desire to achieve his aims in regard to Austria by evolutionary means. Schuschnigg appointed Hitler's choice Arthur Seyss-Inquart Interior Minister and National Police Chief on February 15th. The next day in Berlin, Seyss-Inquart told Hitler of his intention to operate strictly on the basis of a self-sufficient and independent Austria, and within the framework of the Constitution. Hitler accepted this. Addressing the German parliament on February 20th, the Führer thanked Schuschnigg for his understanding and kindness. He predicted that, quote, friendly cooperation between the two countries in every field has been assured, end quote. The following day, he received Austria's underground National Socialist leader, Joseph Leopold. Calling his activities insane, he briskly ordered Leopold and his 4 chief lieutenants to pack up and move to Germany. Hitler believed that the compact ensured a period of harmony that would gradually bring Austria into the German realm through democratic means. Schuschnigg did not share this belief. Theodor Hornbostel, chief of the Austrian State Chancellery, told the British ambassador that month that the loosely defined guidelines of the agreement with Hitler would be easy to circumvent. Hornbostel confided that his government, quote, really doesn't want to put them into practice, end quote. Stability in Austria, however, deteriorated. The International Stock Exchange, with its usual nose for ominous developments, experienced a sudden flight from the Austrian shilling. Austrian government bonds plummeted in value, especially in London and Zurich. National Socialist sympathizers in the Fatherland Front and in the Austrian youth organizations steadily transformed the political disposition of these groups. Spontaneous mass demonstrations by National Socialists enjoyed popular support. Graz, for all practical purposes, came under their control. In many areas, Schuschnigg's followers scarcely risked appearing in public. So this is like Macron in France right now. The guy's technically in power, but not for long. Displaying his customary lack of political finesse, Schuschnigg took a desperate step to rescue his career. In Innsbruck on March 9th, he announced a national plebiscite to take place in 4 days' time. The purpose was to give voters the opportunity to affirm their confidence in the government and preference for Austrian independence. Such a poll could only accentuate the division between Germany and Austria. It transgressed against the spirit of the evolutionary process of assimilating the two cultures, a process Schuschnigg had accepted by signing the agreement with Germany. And here's a picture. Kurt Schuschnigg, Austria's unpopular dictator, announces a national plebiscite or referendum in a last-ditch bid to preserve Austrian independence in 1938. And if you watch The Sound of Music or any of these Jew-made propaganda movies, they don't mention any of this, how unpopular Schuschnigg was. Anyhow, since no elections had taken place since 1932, there was no current lists of registered voters. There was insufficient time to prepare new rosters. Only citizens above 25 years of age were eligible. This prevented young adults, disproportionately large percentage of whom backed National Socialism, from participating. The General Secretary of the Fatherland Front, Guido Zanato, prepared guidelines that allowed only members of the reigning political party to staff the balloting stations. The ballot cards had the word yes printed on one side and were blank on the other. This required people voting no to write the word in the same size characters on the back of the card. Polling station personnel, all members of the Fatherland Front, would therefore be able to identify dissenters. During preparations for the election, the government press announced that anyone voting, quote, no would be guilty of treason. So, here's an election. If you vote against us, it'll be known, and it's treason. You know, pretty fair and open election there, Goy. A publication of these details evoked protests from the national opposition. Fearing German intervention, Schuschnigg appealed to France and Britain for assistance. In the midst of another cabinet crisis, France could not respond. The British recognized the plebiscite as a flagrant challenge to Hitler. Chamberlain called the plebiscite a blunder. Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax considered Schuschnigg's maneuver foolish and provocative. He blandly informed the Austrian dictator that England could offer neither advice nor protection. Halifax could not help adding that Schuschnigg failed to seek Britain's consul before announcing the plebiscite, which has caused so much trouble. Hitler was aghast that Schuschnigg violated their agreement only weeks after signing. At first, he simply refused to believe the news. However, once he did, his reaction was temperate. He flew his diplomatic troubleshooter Wilhelm Kepler to Vienna. Kepler's instructions were to either prevent the plebiscite, quote, without military threats, end quote, or at least arrange for it to include the opportunity to vote for Anschluss, or unification, with Germany. Seyss-Inquart and General Edmund von Glaser-Horstenau, minority representative in the Austrian cabinet, confronted Schuschnigg. They pointed out that the entire balloting process drawn up by the Fatherland Front violated the Constitution. They demanded a postponement, allowing time to prepare a plebiscite in which all parties would be fairly represented. The dictator summoned Defense Secretary General Sena, Security Chief Colonel Skubel, and Lieutenant Marshal Hugert of the Fatherland Front militia. He asked whether armed resistance against a German invasion was feasible. The Austrian army, reduced to 30,000 men by the 1919 treaty, was not mobilized. Skubel dismissed the police force as too saturated with National Socialists to be reliable. Only the militia, Hugert assured the Bundeskanzler, was prepared. Recognizing this force as insufficient, Schuschnigg attempted without success to telephone Mussolini to solicit military aid. Out of options, he resigned as Chancellor. This terminated the era of a politician who entreated Austria's wartime enemies, France, Britain, and Italy, and called upon its own followers as well to transform his country into a battleground in a war against his German brethren and former comrades-in-arms in the World War. Schuschnigg's entire cabinet withdrew, and Austria was, practically speaking, without a government. Throughout the land, members of Austria's SA and its smaller elite cousin, the SS, began assuming administrative functions. The following day, on March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria. Schuschnigg ordered the Austrian army not to resist. Hitler's decision to militarily occupy Austria was neither premeditated nor desired by him. He had hoped to maintain a semblance of legality in assimilating Austria. With Seyss-Inquart as Bundeskanzler and a new cabinet, the two governments could have coordinated the transition smoothly via the evolutionary process. In fact, the German Army General Staff had no operational plan for an invasion of Austria in place. The entire maneuver was impromptu. The Führer was aware of the bad publicity abroad such an apparent act of force would generate. However, he feared that Austrian Marxists might capitalize on the country's momentary political vacuum and stage an uprising. Göring warned of the possibility that the Alpine Republic's neighbors might also exploit its temporary weakness. Italy could occupy eastern Tyrol, Yugoslavia, the Kärnten province, and Hungary, the Burgenland. Yugoslavia had already annexed part of Kärnten in 1919 during Austria's post-war impotence. Oh, it's hard switching. Described as aggression by the foreign press, the German army's advance made a welcome impression inside Austria. A sergeant of the SS, Signals Battalion related his experience while sent with a comrade ahead of the column to reconnoiter the route to Vienna. 2 days underway, the pair stopped at an inn. As the soldiers entered, almost everyone present rose and greeted us with shouts of Heil. We were pressed to a table, the waiters rushed over with coffee and pastries, and we kept shaking hands with people, answering questions, and expressing our gratitude for all the attention. It was harder to leave the inn. The guests stood up, clapped, wished us well, and stuffed cigarettes in our pockets. Another member of the battalion gave this account, quote, "The closer the column approached Vienna, the greater was the rejoicing of the people to their joy. They gave full expression to their joy, shook hands with the soldiers in the vehicles, and tossed flowers and packs of cigarettes to them. Everyone seemed seized with frenzy. Throughout the military occupation of Austria, largely symbolic in nature, not a single shot was fired, nor was a person injured." So much for the whole violent German invasion of Austria. They were welcomed as heroes. Not a single shot fired or person injured. During anyhow, I'll keep reading. Hitler scheduled joint plebiscites in Austria and Germany for April 10, 1938. Both populations decided on whether to incorporate the two countries into a single state. The people of Austria cast 99.73% of their ballots in favor of Anschluss with Germany. The Germans voted 99.08% for unification, a testimony to how distinct Schuschnigg had been to the heartbeat of his nation. He had personally estimated in early March that 70% of the Austrian populace supported his regime's policy of independence. So, I'm going to take a break for a few minutes here. I'll leave playing, let's see, what can we leave here? Here's a song for the Jews in power right now. This is a song, "Be Happy That It Was, but Don't Cry That It No Longer Is." And that, of course, is referring to their power.
Den das Schicksal uns gönnt. Und dann sehen wir traurig zurück. Viel zu schnell vergeht der Augenblick. Weine nicht, wenn es vorbei ist. Freu dich lieber, lass es wahr. Trag das Glück in deinem Herzen und es bleibt für immer da. Weine nicht, wenn es vorbei ist. Freu dich lieber, lass es wahr. Und sei einfach froh und dankbar für das Gute, das geschah. Jeder Tag hält Wunder für uns bereit, aber nichts ist so stark wie die Zeit, denn nur sie ganz alleine bestimmt, was sie gibt und was sie uns nimmt. Weine nicht, wenn es vorbei ist. Freu dich lieber, lass es wahr. Trag das Glück in deinem Herzen und es bleibt für immer da. dein Leben lang bestehen.
Anyhow, pardon me for that song. It's not the most fitting, but it was on my YouTube playlist, so I went ahead and pressed it. Weine nicht, dass es vorbei ist. Freu dich, liebe, dass es war. That's right, Jews. Be happy that you got to rule our countries for this long. But, don't get angry and do anything crazy now that you're losing power. Just accept it and move on to wherever you're going to go. And that is not to a new government set up to be tyrannical over us. And let's see, here we go. On March 18, 1938, the German government notified the League of Nations that Austria had cancelled its affiliation. This international body, which had never manifested concern for the plight of the distressed little nation, now debated whether Germany was responsible for paying Austria's delinquent membership dues of 50,000 Swiss francs from January 1st to March 13th. This ended the chain of circumstances leading to the unification of Hitler's homeland with the German Reich, an event known in history as the Rape of Austria. The Rape of Austria. Almost 100% of Austrians, like over 99% of Austrians voted for unification, and over 99% of Germans did too. This was the will of the people, and that is the thing in white countries which Jews wish to squash under their jackboot of tyranny. By the way, I don't know if it mentions this in this book, but the Rothschilds had been propping up the dictatorship of Austria, trying to keep it from joining with its German fatherland, which the people wanted overwhelmingly. The next section is called Czechoslovakia, still on Chapter 3 of Hitler's Revolution. A few months after the Anschluss, Germany had annexed the Sudetenland, the ethnic German territory lining the periphery of western Czechoslovakia. The transfer of this region to German control provoked a serious war scare. The controversy traced its origin to the 1919 Versailles system. During World War I, Czechs served in the Austro-Hungarian army. Immigrants in London and Paris established the Czech Committee on November 14, 1915. Two Czechs in exile, Thomas Marziak and Edward Beneš, won the Entente's endorsement for a future Czechoslovak state to be carved from the portions of the Habsburg realm. On October 18, 1919, Czechs in Paris and in the USA claimed Czechoslovakian independence. The new country had three components. The furthest east was Ruthenia, the population of which voluntarily joined Czechoslovakia. In the center was Slovakia, and many Slovaks wanted independence, or at least considered autonomy, and considerable autonomy. The western part consisted of Bohemia and Moravia, where 3 million German Austrians dwelled with the Czechs. These Germans wished to remain with Austria. Marziak and Beneš enjoyed prevailing influence in fashioning the post-war structure of Czechoslovakia. Marziak persuaded Wilson to alter his 14 points, which promised each nationality of Austria-Hungary the opportunity for autonomous development, to exclude Germans. So basically, just the Germans getting screwed again. This time the Czech Germans. I actually am friends with a family whose grandparents had to flee this area after World War II, and they had a lot of friends that didn't make it. But moving on, Beneš consciously underestimated the number of Sudeten Germans by nearly 1 million. He falsely claimed that they were not a unified minority, but lived in settlements integrated with Czechs. Quote, "The Germans in Bohemia are only colonists," he asserted. Rich in raw materials and industry, the border territory offered Czechoslovakia a topographical defense barrier against Germany. Beneš based his deliberations more on economic and strategic advantages than on the natural rights of the population. The 1910 census offered a comparison of the number of German colonists wishing to remain with Austria in the affected areas to Czechs residing there. In Bohemia lived 2,070,438 Germans to the 116,000 Czechs. So There were 20 times as many Germans as there were Czechs in this place that was forced from Austria and Germany. In the Sudetenland, 643,800 Germans to 25,000 Czechs. So, in the Sudetenland, 643,000 versus 25,000. In the Bohemian Forest, 176,000 Germans to 6,000 Czechs. So this is ridiculous. These are clearly German territories, or Austrian German territories. In southern Moravia, 180,000 Germans compared to just 12,000 Czechs. Since the Paris Peace Conference continued until mid-1919, the German provinces were still technically part of Austria when the Austrian Republic held its first democratic election on February 16th. The Sudeten Germans prepared ballots to participate. The Czech army forcibly disrupted arrangements. On March 4th, thousands of Sudeten Germans organized peaceful demonstrations in their towns and villages to protest. Czech soldiers fired into the unarmed crowds, killing 54 Germans, 20 of them women. The Allies finalized a compact with Czechoslovakia, formally recognizing her statehood. The preamble to the document endorsed the arrangement. Quote, in consideration that the peoples of Bohemia, Moravia, and part of Silesia, as well as the people of Slovakia, have decided of their own free will to join into a lasting union, end quote, Beneš promised to the Allies, quote, to give the Germans all rights they are entitled to. It will all in all be a very liberal regime, end quote. So they were promised that the Germans would be treated with respect, etc., etc. Denigrating the ethnic German population to, quote, immigrant status, the Czech government instituted a policy of rapid de-Germanizing in Bohemia and the Sudetenland. Prague transferred military garrisons, railroad personnel, civil servants, prison populations, and even hospital patients in large numbers there to manipulate the census figures. Czech officials tallied Czech transients as residents, even though, quote, residency seldom extended beyond 2 days. In Trautenau, in northern Bohemia, a 600-man Czech infantry battalion spent one winter day in an unfinished barracks to be counted in the survey. Oh, God. The resulting statistics deprived German districts of adequate representation in the parliament. Prague occasionally employed less subtle means to maintain its minorities' political impotence. At an election rally of the Sudeten German Party in Teplitz-Schönau in 1937, the key speaker, Karl Frank, criticized Beneš. Czech police scattered the assembly. 53 Germans died in the melee and hundreds suffered injury. Prague authorities closed smaller German schools throughout the Sudetenland. They replaced them with Czech language institutions, often requiring German youngsters to attend. So this is the same as in France. They tried to strip them of their ethnic identity. In the Saar region, they had in Alsace-Lorraine, they had forced all the German language schools to teach French in French instead of in German. And here in the Sudetenland, which was like 89-90% German, they forced the German kids to take their classes in Czech instead of German. Let's see. Only 4.7% of state financial... Okay, so the government closed 9 of Bohemia's 19 German universities. Only 4.7% of state financial assistance went to German college students, although ethnic Germans composed nearly a fourth of Czechoslovakia's population. The government issued all public forms and applications in Czech language, even in the Sudetenland. Half the German municipal and rural officials lost their jobs, 41% of the German postmen, and 48.5% of the railroad personnel. The Czechoslovakian government Land Reform Act redistributed real estate so that every rural family would receive sufficient acreage to subsist from the soil. The head of the program, Karl Vikovsky, defined the results as follows, quote, the soil is passing from the hands of the foreigners into the hands of the Czech people, end quote. Most went to Czech legionaries and their families. Vikovsky auctioned off the balance to affluent Czechs and Slovaks. They purchased the properties below market value, allowing the former owners to return as tenant farmers. The Germans in Bohemia and Moravia lost 25% of their land to Czechs through the state-sponsored land reform. Approximately one-third of the Sudetenland consisted of woodlands, of which the state took over administration. The authorities dismissed some of the 40,000 German forestry workers, replacing them with Czechs. By 1931, the number of ethnic German tradesmen out of work was 3 times that of the Czechs. Relief efforts concentrated on areas with predominantly Czech populations. A study by the British Foreign Office in 1936 estimated that Czechoslovakia's German colony, approximately 22% of the population, comprised 60% of the unemployed. So, Germans were vastly overrepresented in unemployment. Among the most economically distressed areas was Reichenberg, once the home to a thriving glass and textile industry. Between 1922 and 1936, 153 factories there closed. Prague awarded contracts for construction and other public works projects for Reichenberg to foreign companies who brought in their own labor. So basically, they're just trying to destroy the Germans in the Sudetenland, which the Jews later did at the end of World War II. Benes described his people as, quote, mortal enemies of the Germans, end quote. In May 1919, during the inauguration ceremony in Pilsen, for President Thomas Marziak, Czechs broke into an apartment not displaying a flag in the window for the occasion. The resident, a German widow and mother of 4, was bedridden from illness. The intruders dragged her down the staircase feet first and into the street, her head bouncing off the steps during the descent. She died from her injuries. In 1921, Marziak deployed Czech troops in German settlements without provocation. In Graslitz, 4 miles from the frontier with Germany, protesters clashed with the entering Czech military personnel. The soldiers shot 15 Bohemian Germans dead. Under the, quote, law to protect the Republic, Czech authorities arrested Sudeten Germans demanding self-determination as traitors or spies. They jailed for espionage tourists from Germany visiting Czechoslovakia for sports competitions or for ethnic festivals. Between 1923 and 1932, the state conducted 8,972 legal proceedings against dissident members of ethnic minorities. Defendants in sedition trials often included Sudeten Germans belonging to sports leagues, youth groups, singing societies, or backpacking clubs. Prague established an immense, quote, border zone, in which lived 85% of all Sudeten Germans. The entire Polish and Ruthenian populations and 95% of the Hungarian colony. It came under permanent martial law. The army supervised the administration of factories, major construction projects, public works, the telephone service, and forestry. Military authorities limited the civil liberties of citizens in the, quote, border zone, which comprised 56% of the entire country. This did not prevent Benes from lauding Czechoslovakia as, quote, a lighthouse of democracy. God. Ridiculous. There's a picture here. Czech soldiers occupy an ethnic German community to enforce martial law in the country's expansive so-called border zone. Although during the first years of Hitler's chancellorship, few among the German public were concerned with Czechoslovakia, for Hitler himself, the fate of the Sudetenland symbolized the tragedy of Germans under foreign rule. The Sudeten people waged a dogged, solitary struggle to maintain their German identity. Hitler made it his personal mission to recover the Sudetenland. He introduced the topic during the Reichstag speech in February 20th, 1938. As long as Germany was herself weak and defenseless, she had to simply accept the continuous persecution of German people along all our borders. The interests of the German Reich also include the protection of those fellow Germans who are unable, on their own, on our very frontier, to ensure the right to basic human, political, and ideological freedoms. End quote. Another circumstance turned Hitler's attention to Czechoslovakia. Geographically, the country resembled a spear point penetrating deeply into the Reich's territory. This represented a potential national security threat no responsible leader could ignore. In January 1924, Paris and Prague concluded a friendship pact containing a military clause. This envisioned mutual general staff tasks. This envisioned mutual general staff talks to prepare a joint defensive strategy in case of attack by a common enemy. The signatories followed with a formal military treaty in October 1925. Beneš replaced the 85-year-old Marziak as president of the Republic in December 1935. Only months before becoming president, Beneš, as foreign minister, had concluded a military alliance with the Soviet Union, which was, by the way, 85% Jewish in its politicians prior to World War II. The pact provided for significant Czech-Russian cooperation. By the beginning of 1936, the Czechs had completed 32 airfield sites near the German frontier as bases for the rapidly expanding Red Air Force. So the Czech Shabaskoyim were preparing bases for the Soviets to launch an attack against Germany with. They established depots to stockpile aviation fuel, aerial bombs, and other war material. The Red Army stationed troops in Bohemia and Moravia to undergo parachute training for a possible airborne assault against Germany. It transferred officers to the Czechoslovakian War Ministry in Prague and to local command centers. On February 12, 1937, the Daily Mail reported that immediately after ratification of the Prague-Moscow Pact, Russian flight officers inspected Czech air bases and fuel dumps for their air force. So, there's a picture here. Czech and Red Army officers inspect Czechoslovakian defenses together during 1938. Prague allows the Soviets to train troops in Czechoslovakia, unsettling the Germans. Prague was a converging point for communist immigrants who had fled Germany in 1933 and Austria after the Anschluss. Sir Orma Sargent of the British Foreign Office called Czechoslovakia a, quote, distribution center for Stalin's Comintern propaganda against Germany. With France, Czechoslovakia, and the USSR connected by military alliances since 1936, the Führer felt boxed in. He had re-garrisoned the Rhineland on March 7th of that year. When he re-garrisoned the Rhineland on March 7th of that year, Beneš offered France the support of Czechoslovakian army for a joint invasion of Germany. During the months to follow, it swelled to a force of 1,453,000 men. Wow. And Germany just wanted 200,000. They couldn't have it. So here, Czechoslovakia is openly offering to France to launch a joint attack, just as they had been doing with the Soviet Union. The Germans were undecided how to recover the Sudetenland. In 1938, the British ambassador in Prague, Sir Basil Newton, advised the Foreign Office, quote, "How precisely they will proceed, it is impossible to prophesy. But the indications are that they will at first seek to achieve their aims by friendly diplomacy rather than by physical or economic terrorism," end quote. On May 6, the British newspaper magnate Lord Harold Waldemer praised the Germans as, quote, "very patient people," in an edition in the Daily Mail. The Austrian Anschluss encouraged the Sudeten German party, the SDP. Under the leadership of its founder, Konrad Heinlein, it had already won 44 seats in the Czechoslovakian Chamber of Deputies and 23 in the Senate in the May 1935 elections. At an SDP rally in Carlsbad on April 25, 1938, Heinlein demanded autonomy for the ethnic German region. With 90% of Sudeten voters behind him, he had sufficient influence to compel the Czechs to enter negotiations. So this is an oppressed minority here that demanded its rights. This is what whites need to do. Heinlein and Karl Frank had met with Hitler on March 28, but were unable to persuade the Führer to pressure the Czechs. Ribbentrop told the two guests that it was not Germany's task, quote, "to offer individuals suggestions as to what demands should be made of the Czechoslovakian government," end quote. Berlin instructed the German embassy in Prague to limit support of the SDP to private talks with Czechoslovakian statesmen. Quote, "if the occasion presents itself," end quote. The allegation of post-war historians that At the meeting, Hitler ordered Heinlein to impose impossible terms in order to provoke the Czechs is without substance. The British government monitored the escalating controversy. Quote, "The plain fact is that the Sudetendeutsche are being oppressed by the Czechs," noted Vansittart. Vansittart? Yeah, that's the name of the guy. Newton sent London a detailed analysis from Prague on March 15th. He predicted that as long as they can reckon with Anglo-French support in the event of an armed clash with Germany, the Czechs will pursue their present policy. The Germans cannot be deterred from aggression if they consider it necessary. If Paris and London encourage Prague to resist compromise, war is inevitable. Continuing the quote here, England and France, Newton continued, cannot prevent Czechoslovakia from being overrun. At most, they can wage a war to restore a status quo that is already proving unworkable. He concluded that no German government will accept, quote, a hostile Czechoslovakia in their flank, end quote. Having read Newton's report, the British ambassador in Berlin, Henderson, cabled his ministry on May 17th, "I share unreservedly and in all respects views expressed by Mr. Newton in his telegram." The Cabinet Committee on Foreign Policy discussed Newton's analysis the following day. As its minutes record, quote, "The Minister for Coordination of Defense said that he had been struck." I'm actually going to have to cut this off for today. I'm losing my voice. I'm stuffy and not feeling too well. I still haven't quite recovered from driving straight down to Newport and back, so I'm going to stop the recording for the day. Join me next time as I finish the last, I don't know, 15, 20 pages of Chapter 3. We'll get to this another time. Thanks for tuning in today for today's edition of Hitler's Revolution, Chapter 3. This is probably my worst oration of a book so far, this Chapter 3, but I felt the need to continue on with this book. It's an important one. Have a good one, Glenn. Good